Samples. This light is sending out one sample, and you're probably wondering what a sample is. You are going to be using samples, talking about samples for the entirety of the semester. Oh boy. You may have noticed that in the shadow area here in my render, I've got all of these little speckledy things. These little speckledy things are indications that my sample settings are maybe a little bit too low. This is fine for a preview render, like the ones that I've been doing, but isn't a final render that I could hand off to my teacher, or a client, or a production company. Instead of changing the light samples, I am going to make a bigger example by going over to my render settings and looking at the Arnold Renderer tab. In Arnold Renderer, I have a variety of different types of samples. I have this thing called Camera AA. AA stands for anti-aliasing. When I'm converting from vector to raster, you'll remember that raster images are pixel grids. So I'm seeing individual pixels. Anti-aliasing is a way of smoothing out those pixel edges to try to get a smoother, less jagged render. Under Camera AA, I've got diffuse, specular, transmission, subsurface scattering, and volume indirect. Each of these has a number after it. Camera AA has 3. The rest of them have 2. Now, these numbers aren't the real number of samples that I'm sending out, and a sample is a query, a little question that each pixel sends out. So right now it looks like each pixel is sending out 2 queries about diffuse color. It's actually sending out 4 queries per diffuse color because each of these numbers is squared. But it's not really sending out 4 diffuse queries per sample. It's actually sending out 36 because the camera anti-aliasing is a multiplier for the rest of these sample values. So camera AA squared is 9. 9 times 4 is 36, so I'm sending out 36 queries for each of these. This is a fairly low number, and as I turn this up, let's come over here. I am going to take a snapshot, and then I am going to turn my camera AA number up to 5. My render will take longer. Every time you turn your sample settings up, your render is going to take longer. However, the resulting render should be smoother and generally better. So this render here, you can see I've still got some grain, some noise in this shadow area. But if I set my snapshot to A, let's come over here and look just at that shadow. This side, the B side, had 5 samples, 5 AA samples. This side had 3, and you can see that this side is in fact much rougher. This side did take 19 seconds to render. If I turn this up even higher, maybe I'll go to 7. Again, I will get a resulting smoother render over on this side, but it will take longer, and you can start to see how render time can build up. Professional studios like the Marvel movies have extraordinarily long render times to get those hyper-realistic renders. I've heard that a single frame of a Marvel movie can take upwards of thousands of hours. However, what they do is they use a service called a render farm, where instead of using a single processor for rendering, they're rendering across thousands of processors, which reduces the time from hours down to seconds. There are virtual render farm services. Brookdale doesn't have one, so you would have to do some research on your own to find one, but if you do find that your renders are taking a long time, you may want to look into a render farm. Alright. My 7 sample render is so much better than my 3 sample render. Look at how smooth that shadow is. That is a lot better. It did take 37 seconds to render, so you can see that my render times build up pretty quickly. While I'm over here in sampling, there are some other things that I should talk about. First, there's this thing called adaptive sampling. What adaptive sampling allows you to do is it allows you to set a maximum number of AA samples. The default number is 20. This is meant for times when you're doing things like motion blur, where a specific part of your render is going to need a lot more samples, but most of the render will be fine with a small number. In this case, when I enable adaptive sampling, Maya will send out samples first to find those detail areas, and then in the places it thinks it needs more samples, it will send out more samples. In the places it thinks it doesn't need the samples, it will send out a smaller number. Along with adaptive sampling, I can clamp my AA sample, so I can say, all right, there's a maximum of 20, but for this render, I don't want you to go above this value. And that will really help speeding my renders up. The filter type is to determine my anti-aliasing values. I'm using a Gaussian filter by default, and that's just fine. Gaussian is probably going to work for 99 out of 100 renders. If you want to try some other options, go right ahead. You may see a difference, you may not. And finally, under Advanced, I have the ability to lock in a sampling pattern. Sometimes when you're doing a render sequence, rather than a single frame render, you'll see a little bit of a flicker in the sampling pattern as your shadows move or your lights move. This happens more at lower sample values. Locking in that sample pattern can reduce some of the flicker that you're seeing in your render, so that's a good thing to do when you're getting a result that you're not happy with. Now, the samples that I've got over here in the light may help you refine this light, but they probably won't help you refine your scene that much. So go ahead, play around with your light samples, but I would encourage you to spend more time over in your render settings, adjusting your camera AA samples to see if that gives you a better, smoother scene.